first time I heard the name Jude in Lagos, it wasn't in a cathedral with stained glass and incense. It was in a cramped corridor behind a shrine, hot as a closed oven, where the air smelled like melted candle wax, damp concrete, and that sour edge of old sweat. A woman in a neat headscarf held a crumpled piece of paper so tightly her knuckles went pale. On it, in shaky handwriting, were 3 words: "I am finished." She pushed it into a box already swollen with thousands of folded pleas, some smeared by rain, some dotted with oily fingerprints, some stuck together like they'd been dipped in fear. And then, this is the part that turns your stomach. She didn't pray politely. She prayed like a drowning person fights for air. She pressed her forehead to the wall where wax had dripped for years in thick ridges, and her lips touched the sticky surface by accident. She pulled back with a grimace, wiped her mouth, and kept going anyway. Because when a life is collapsing, dignity becomes a luxury. She whispered one name again and again, Saint Jude Thaddeus, not as poetry, but as a last match struck in a storm. If you came here looking for the story of the patron of hopeless cases, you found it. But if you think this is going to be a gentle tale about a saint with a calm face in a painting, stay with me. Because Jude's whole life is a war against a rival that tried to erase him from history, a rival with the same first name and the most infamous kiss ever given. And that rivalry is exactly why, 2,000 years later, people in Nigeria still run to him when everything else has failed. He was born into a world that didn't care about your plans. In the 1st century, Galilee wasn't a Holy Land souvenir map. It was dust and taxes and Roman boots. It was fishermen's hands split by rope and farmers measuring their grain like it might be stolen by morning. It was politics, whispered and sharp, because saying the wrong thing out loud could buy you a beating. Or worse, Jude grew up hearing names that carried weight: Caesar, Herod, Pilate, names that made people lower their voices. But in his own home, the names that mattered were simpler: mother, father, brother, a loaf of bread, a jug of water, a prayer said at night with tired sincerity. Tradition calls him Judas, sometimes Judas of James, sometimes Thaddeus, sometimes Lebbaeus, like the world couldn't decide what to call him. Even that confusion feels like a prophecy, because the first battle of his life wasn't with a sword. It was with his own name. Imagine being a boy and realizing early that names can be traps. That one word, said by the wrong mouth, can paint you as loyal or dangerous, pure or stained. Judas was a respected name at the time, rooted in the history of Israel. It wasn't cursed yet. Not yet. But Jude's youth happened in a pressure cooker. People argued about God the way starving people argue about food. Some wanted quiet survival. Others wanted rebellion. Some dreamed of a Messiah like a hammer, someone who would crack Rome in half and set Israel free by force. And Jude, young, watchful, learning the human face, noticed something. When people are desperate, they start worshiping outcomes instead of truth. He'd see it at the edge of town. Men with hard eyes gathering after dusk, speaking in urgent fragments. Freedom, blood, justice, revenge. He'd see women bargaining for bread, children swallowing fear like it was normal water. He'd see priests teaching holiness, while rich men walked past hungry families without blinking. The world felt like a riddle with too many wrong answers. And somewhere inside Jude, a question began to grow teeth. If God is real, why does life feel like a trap? This wasn't a philosophical question asked in a clean room. This was the question of someone who has watched sickness flatten a strong man in days, someone who has seen a family sell heirlooms to pay taxes, someone who has felt the humiliating power of empire, how it can make you feel small without ever touching you. Jude didn't start as a saint. He started as a human being who learned how quickly hope can rot. And yet, here's the twist. He wasn't the loudest in the room. He wasn't the one trying to impress people with rage. Jude's strength grew in a quieter place. He learned how to endure, to hold steady, to watch the patterns of people, the way lies repeat themselves with new clothing. He had the kind of mind that remembers details. Who said what? Who meant it? Who was performing? That kind of mind is dangerous in a world full of slogans, because slogans don't like witnesses. There's a scene I want you to picture, because it's the kind of scene that forms a person. A marketplace in Galilee. Midday heat. Flies. The smell of fish and crushed herbs and animals too close to people. A Roman soldier walks through like the world is his hallway. People don't stare. They pretend not to see. A vendor's hand trembles as he measures grain. A child coughs hard. Too hard for a child. Jude stands there and feels something split in him, anger at the cruelty and disgust at the cowardice, including his own. The way everyone's eyes drop. The way fear teaches you to live bent. In that moment, Jude understands something terrible. If a savior comes, the battle won't only be against Rome. It will be against what Rome has done inside people. And Jude begins to notice the other battle, too. The battle for stories. In a village, truth doesn't travel like a letter. It travels like smoke. It changes shape depending on who breathes it in. People tell the same story differently depending on who they want to punish, who they want to protect, and what they're trying to sell. So Jude learns to be careful with words. That matters later. A lot later. Because the rival that will haunt Jude's life isn't a Roman general. It's another disciple, another Judas. But long before that betrayal becomes famous, Jude senses something else. Not every man who talks about God is actually listening to him. Some are using God as a weapon. Some are using God as a mask. And some are using God as a ladder. He sees a traveling teacher once, sharp tongue, shining eyes, drawing a crowd like a magnet. The teacher speaks about holiness, but the words feel slick, like oiled stones. People cheer because the teacher makes them feel superior to someone else. Jude watches and feels his stomach tighten, because it's easy to love a God who flatters you. It's harder to love a God who demands you become new. Jude doesn't know it yet, but he's being prepared for a different kind of teacher, one who won't flatter the crowd, one who won't sell rage as righteousness. Still, Jude is young. He's human. And the hope of a violent Messiah has a certain seduction, especially when you've seen injustice up close. There are nights Jude imagines it. Rome pushed back into the sea, soldiers running, Israel standing tall, shame reversed. And then he imagines the cost. Bodies in the street, mothers screaming, villages burned in retaliation. Freedom, purchased by fire. He doesn't want that. But what else is there? This is where the tension tightens. Jude's heart becomes a battlefield between two temptations. One says, take power, force the world to change. The other says, endure, wait for God. But what if God never comes? And in that waiting, where faith feels like holding your breath underwater, Jude hears rumors, not rumors about politics, rumors about a man who touches lepers, a man who eats with the wrong people, a man who speaks about a kingdom that doesn't start with killing your enemy, a man who talks about God like he's a father, not a distant judge. At first, Jude dismisses it. Galilee produces rumors the way heat produces mirages. People get excited, then disappointed, then excited again. But the rumors keep returning, stubborn as a drumbeat. And then Jude hears a detail that makes him stop cold. This man, Jesus of Nazareth, has enemies already. Not just Rome, not just the local elite. He has enemies among the religious leaders too, because he's not playing their game. That kind of person is either a liar or a threat to every comfortable lie. Jude feels the pull of curiosity like a hook under the ribs. But curiosity is dangerous when you live under empire. Curiosity gets you noticed. Curiosity gets your name written down. And Jude has learned to be careful with names. Because even before betrayal stains the word forever, Jude has felt how a name can become a cage. So he keeps his interest quiet. He listens from the edges when travelers talk. He watches faces. He waits for contradictions. And then, one day, he hears something that hits like a stone through glass. Jesus has said that loving God means loving your enemy, not tolerating, not avoiding, loving. Jude almost laughs, because it sounds impossible, like telling a starving man to enjoy hunger. But the idea won't leave him alone. Love your enemy. Then what happens to the world built on enemies? Because that's the world Jude knows. Tribes and factions and grudges passed down like inheritance. A world where a rival is not just a competitor, he's the reason you sleep with a knife near your bed. And yet, Jude can't shake the feeling that Jesus' message isn't weakness. It might be something sharper, something that cuts deeper than revolt. If Jude's childhood taught him that oppression can bend the body, Jesus' rumor suggests something more unsettling. The deepest, slavery might be inside the soul. Now Jude is trapped between two futures. If he ignores Jesus, he stays safe, but safe in a world that keeps grinding people into dust. If he follows, he risks everything: family, reputation, possibly his life. And still, Jude hesitates. Here's another twist, one most people don't think about. Jude's eventual fame as patron of hopeless causes doesn't begin with him being fearless. It begins with him being afraid, and moving anyway, because he senses that if he waits for certainty, he will die inside long before his body is buried. And somewhere in the back of his mind, another fear sharpens, like a rival stepping into the light. What if Jesus chooses 12 followers? And among them is someone who looks holy but carries a hidden hunger for betrayal? What if the greatest danger isn't outside the circle? What if it's inside? Jude doesn't know that one of the 12 will be named Judas too. He doesn't know that history will remember that Judas like a wound. But Jude can already feel the shadow of competition between two kinds of men. The man who loves the truth, even when it costs him. And the man who uses the truth as long as it profits him, and Jude is about to walk straight into that arena. He doesn't realize it yet, but the moment he steps toward Jesus, he is also stepping toward the rival who will poison his name for centuries. And that, strangely, will become the reason millions of people, from quiet bedrooms to crowded shrines in Nigeria, will later call him the Saint of the Impossible. Because Jude will learn what most people only learn when it's too late. Your name can be ruined. Your reputation can be stolen. Your plans can collapse. And still, God can build something out of the wreckage. Jude turns toward the road where the rumors came from. Not with confidence, with need. With a heart that has finally admitted, I can't fix this world, but maybe I can be remade. And as he takes his first steps, the story stops being about survival and becomes about surrender. The road Jude took wasn't wide, and it wasn't heroic. It was the kind of road that makes you sweat for reasons that have nothing to do with heat, because every step forward feels like you are leaving your old self behind in the dust, and you don't know what will be waiting when you turn the corner. He found Jesus the way most people found him, not in a palace, but in the middle of ordinary chaos. A crowd, tight as knotted rope, a ring of faces, hungry, suspicious, fascinated. The air had that restless crackle that happens when people sense something is about to break open. Jude stood at the edge at first, shoulder pressed near a stranger's, breathing other people's breath, smelling fish salt and sweat and sun-warmed fabric. And then he saw him. Not glowing, not floating. No theatrical thunder. Just a man with dust on his sandals and calm in his eyes. The kind of calm that doesn't come from ignorance, but from knowing exactly what the world is and refusing to be shaped by it. Jesus was listening to someone speak. Not the polite kind of speaking either. More like spilling. A man's words came out jagged, like stones tumbling down a slope. Anger, fear, shame. The kind of confession people usually keep hidden until they're drunk or dying. Jude expected Jesus to do what every religious performer did, either humiliate the man to look holy or flatter the man to look kind. Instead, Jesus did something that made Jude's stomach tighten. He asked a question, a simple question, soft enough to sound harmless, but it landed like a blade, because Jude could see the man's face change, not because he'd been accused, but because he'd been seen. A murmur moved through the crowd, the way wind moves through tall grass. Jude felt it too. The unsettling thought that if Jesus looked at you long enough, you might become honest against your will. And then something happened. Fast, ugly, unforgettable. The man suddenly lurched forward. His body jerked as if someone had yanked invisible strings inside him. A sound tore out of his throat, half scream, half choke, like a soul trying to escape through a mouth too small. People recoiled. Someone gagged. A woman grabbed her child and shoved him behind her skirts. Jude's skin prickled, not with awe, but with that cold animal disgust you feel when something hidden crawls into the light. For a second, Jude thought, this is madness. This is how crowds become mobs. This is how people get killed. But Jesus didn't flinch. He didn't shout to impress. He didn't step back to protect his reputation. He stepped closer. Close enough that Jude could see the dust on his beard, the lines at the corner of his eyes, the steadiness in his mouth. And he spoke. Quietly. So quietly Jude couldn't hear the exact words, but he could see the effect. It was as if the air itself changed pressure. The man's thrashing slowed. His face softened from rage into confusion into, finally, exhaustion, like someone waking up after years of running. Then the man sagged to his knees and started crying. Not the clean kind of crying, but the messy kind that drags snot and spit with it. The kind that strips you down to your bones in front of strangers. Jude felt his own throat tighten, because he recognized the moment, not the spectacle, the mercy. And he realized something with a punch of terror. If Jesus can pull darkness out of a man like that, what could he pull out of me? That thought should have repelled him. Instead, it pulled him in. He started following at a distance at first, like someone trying to convince himself he's not invested. He'd take the long way so it wouldn't look obvious. He'd stand behind taller men. He'd leave before anyone could talk to him. But Jesus had a way of turning distance into a joke. Wherever Jesus went, something always happened. Not always a miracle. The word miracle makes it sound clean. What Jude saw was messier. Arguments, grief, rage, sudden laughter, people breaking down in public, people changing their minds when they'd sworn they never would. Jude watched Jesus feed a crowd that should have been impossible to feed. He watched a woman reach out like she was stealing healing, and Jesus stop and call her out. Not to shame her, but to restore her dignity in front of everyone. And Jude kept noticing the same pattern. Jesus wasn't collecting fans. He was exposing hearts. He spoke about God like God wasn't a distant flame behind a wall, but a father close enough to disappoint you on purpose. Because that's the thing no one tells you. Sometimes the most loving thing God does is refuse to be used. Jude expected Jesus to announce a revolution in the way men usually announce revolutions: spears, speeches, threats. Instead, Jesus announced a kingdom and then started ruining people's categories. He praised the poor. He warned the religious. He touched the unclean. He welcomed the ones society trained itself to hate. He talked about forgiveness like it was not a feeling, but an order. Jude's mind kept trying to reduce Jesus to something manageable. Teacher, prophet, mystic, dangerous dreamer. But none of those labels held, because Jesus wasn't offering an escape from reality. He was offering an invasion of it. Jude's turning point came on a day that felt too ordinary to be a turning point. Jesus was sitting with a small cluster of followers while others drifted nearby, pretending not to listen. The conversation wasn't lofty. It was about bread, about travel, about what might happen next. It sounded like the planning of a ragged little movement that could be crushed in a week by the wrong official. Then Jesus looked up. Not broadly, like he was addressing a crowd. Specifically, like he was addressing a person. Jude felt that look land on him. The way a hand lands on your shoulder. Come, Jesus said. One word. Not convince me. Not prove yourself. Not pay your way in. Just come. Jude's body went cold, because Jude had been expecting a test. But the test was the invitation itself. You could almost hear his thoughts arguing inside him. If you step forward, you'll be marked. If you step forward, you'll be watched. If you step forward, you might not get to step back. And that's when another figure moved in Jude's peripheral vision. Another man sliding closer to Jesus. Confident, quick, almost eager. A familiar name rose among the followers like a ripple. Judas. Jude's heart did a weird, bitter twist, because suddenly the rivalry wasn't theoretical. It wasn't some future shadow. It was standing right there in flesh and bone, wearing a disciple's face. Jude watched Judas Iscariot's eyes, sharp, calculating, always measuring the crowd. The kind of man who smiles with his mouth while his mind is elsewhere. The kind of man who can make devotion look like ambition. At first, Jude tried to be fair. It's easy to judge someone after the ending. But even before the betrayal became legend, there was something in Judas Iscariot that made Jude uneasy, like a blade hidden in a sleeve. Because Judas Iscariot didn't just follow Jesus. He studied Jesus. Not like a student studies a teacher. Like a gambler studies a game. And Jude knew that type. He'd seen men like that in marketplaces. Always smiling, always listening, always waiting for the moment they can turn information into leverage. Suddenly, Jude understood the cruel irony forming around him. If he joined this circle, he'd share a name with the wrong kind of man. Two Judases in the same band of followers. Two ways of being close to the light. One to be transformed, one to exploit it. Jude stepped forward anyway. Not because he felt brave, because he felt called. That's the part people skip when they tell saint stories. They make the saints sound like marble statues who never sweat. But Jude's first yes tasted like fear. It tasted like surrender. It tasted like walking into a fire without knowing whether it would burn you or purify you. Not long after, Jesus chose 12 men to be close, to learn, to carry the message further than their own breath could reach. When Jude heard his name among them, he almost didn't believe it. For a heartbeat, he wondered if Jesus had made a mistake. Then he looked at Judas Iscariot, who stood nearby with that same faint half-smile, and Jude realized this wasn't a mistake. This was intentional. Because Jesus didn't build his mission out of perfect people. He built it out of real ones. And real ones include both the loyal and the treacherous, standing side by side until the moment the difference becomes visible. From that day, Jude's life became an education in tension. By day, he walked dusty roads with Jesus, listening to teachings that cracked open his assumptions. He watched Jesus confront religious leaders with an honesty that made the air feel dangerous. He watched people cling to Jesus for healing, like he was their last rope above a cliff. By night, Jude lay awake with the other disciples, listening to their breathing and the distant sounds of villages settling into sleep. He'd stare into darkness and feel the weight of what they were doing. Because it started to become clear, Rome wasn't the only threat. The local authorities were starting to circle too. And even more unsettling, some of the disciples were still secretly hoping Jesus would become a political weapon. That's what made Judas Iscariot so dangerous. Judas wasn't the only one confused about Jesus' mission. But he was the one who seemed most determined to force Jesus into a script. Jude began to notice the little things. How Judas praised Jesus loudly in front of crowds, then asked pointed questions in private, questions that sounded spiritual but felt like traps. How Judas always seemed to know where the money was, who was donating, which followers were influential. How Judas spoke about the kingdom with a glint in his eye that looked less like worship and more like strategy. The rivalry between the two Judases grew without ever being officially declared. It wasn't a rivalry of punches. It was a rivalry of motives. And that's the most exhausting kind, because you can't prove it until it's too late. Jude tried to tell himself he was being paranoid. Then he remembered the marketplace, the way men with slick tongues can sell poison as medicine. And he started watching Judas Iscariot the way you watch a storm cloud that hasn't struck yet. Meanwhile, Jesus kept doing things that infuriated the powerful. He spoke about hypocrisy like it was rot, and he wasn't afraid to point at it. He treated women with dignity in a culture that often treated them as property. He treated sinners like humans and saints like people who still needed mercy. And every time he did, Jude could feel the invisible net tightening. There were moments when the disciples argued among themselves, the way brothers argue when they're hungry and stressed. Who is greatest? Who is closest? Who will have authority when Jesus wins? Jude hated those arguments because they smelled like the old world, the world of status and ladders and domination. Yet even Jude wasn't pure. He wanted reassurance. He wanted clarity. He wanted to know how this ends. And there was a moment, quiet but electric, when Jude finally asked the question that had been biting his mind. It happened late, in private, when Jesus spoke about revealing himself, about coming, about love and obedience. The words were beautiful, but also confusing, like looking at a landscape through fog. Jude couldn't hold it anymore. He asked, in essence, "Why will you reveal yourself to us and not to the whole world?" It was an honest question, not a challenge. Jude wasn't trying to corner Jesus. He was trying to understand the logic of God. If you are who we think you are, why not just show everyone? Why not erase doubt with power? Jesus' answer wasn't the kind that satisfies your brain immediately. It was the kind that haunts your heart. He spoke about love, about dwelling, about obedience not as slavery, but as intimacy, about the kingdom entering through changed people, not forced crowds. Jude left that conversation shaken, because he realized the terrifying truth. Jesus wasn't going to conquer the world the way empires conquer. He was going to conquer hearts. And hearts are slower to conquer. Hearts resist. Hearts betray. Hearts require patience, suffering, and, worst of all, trust. That night, Jude understood something else too. The reason Jesus didn't reveal himself in the loud, obvious way was because the loud, obvious way would have fed the same sickness humanity already had. We love power. We worship spectacle. We bow to force. Jesus was building a kingdom that couldn't be sustained by fear, and that meant the path forward would look, from the outside, like defeat. That's when Jude felt the first real taste of hopelessness again. Only this time, it wasn't hopelessness about Rome. It was hopelessness about people. Because if the kingdom depends on people becoming new, what happens when a man like Judas Iscariot stands inside the circle? What happens when betrayal doesn't come from outside enemies but from a familiar hand? And there was another cruelty Jude couldn't ignore. The world was already beginning to confuse the Judases. He'd hear it in whispers. Judas said this. Judas was there. Judas did that. And Jude would feel a chill. Because even now, before, history made its final judgment. The name itself was turning slippery. So Jude began to lean into the other name people sometimes used for him, Thaddeus, a name that felt like armor, not because he was ashamed of Judas as a heritage, but because he sensed a storm coming that would make that name unbearable for generations. He didn't know how right he was. As Jesus' fame grew, so did the hostility. Some religious leaders wanted Jesus silenced. Some political figures wanted him monitored. Some crowds wanted him to perform endlessly like an entertainer. Others wanted him to pick up a sword and lead them. Jesus refused all of it. He kept moving toward Jerusalem like a man walking toward a blade with open eyes. And along the way, Jude witnessed small horrors that never make it into paintings. A mother shoving her sick child forward so aggressively the child nearly fell, because desperation turns love into force. A man screaming at Jesus for not healing him fast enough, because pain makes you irrational and cruel. A crowd praising Jesus one day and doubting him the next, because human loyalty is often just a mood. Jude absorbed it all like a sponge absorbs smoke. And underneath all this, the rivalry with Judas Iscariot sharpened. Sometimes it was subtle. Judas Iscariot would undermine a teaching with a practical question that made others laugh. Sometimes it was social. Judas Iscariot would position himself near influential supporters, as if building alliances. Sometimes it was personal. A sideways glance, a tone of voice that said, "I'm closer than you. I understand him better than you." But Jude began to see the truth. Judas Iscariot didn't understand Jesus better. He understood people better. And he thought Jesus could be used like people. That was the real conflict. Not just good versus evil, but surrender versus control. Jude wanted Jesus to be the center of his life. Judas Iscariot wanted Jesus to be the engine of his plan. And plans get vicious when they start slipping. As they neared Jerusalem, the air itself seemed heavier. The conversations got quieter. The smiles came less easily. At night, the disciples would speak in fragments. What if we're arrested? What if we're attacked? What if this all collapses? Jude would look around at the others and realize how fragile they were. Not weak, just human. Men who had left jobs, families, certainty. Men who had put all their chips on a kingdom they couldn't fully describe. And then Jude would look at Judas Iscariot and feel something like nausea because Judas seemed almost calm, too calm. The calm of a man who already knows what he's going to do. There's a particular kind of dread that comes when you sense betrayal before it happens. It's like smelling smoke before you see flames. You start checking everything, listening harder, trusting less. It poisons sleep. It turns silence into a threat. Jude carried that dread as they entered the city. He didn't know the exact shape of what was coming, but he knew this. The story had reached the part where enemies stop whispering. They start acting. And the most terrifying enemy might be wearing the same name as him. Jerusalem didn't feel like a holy city when Jude entered it. It felt like a throat tightening before a scream. The streets were crowded. Yes, pilgrims, animals, merchants. But underneath the noise there was a nervous electric layer. Like everyone could sense that something was about to snap. Roman patrols moved in clusters, armor flashing. Religious leaders watched from shaded doorways with faces carved into polite stone. Even the air smelled sharper. Sweat, dust, blood from slaughtered lambs, and the thick perfume people used to cover fear. Jude stayed close to Jesus, because closeness suddenly felt like the only sane choice. And yet closeness was also terrifying. Because Jesus was acting like a man who had already read the ending, he spoke in parables that landed like accusations. He looked at the powerful and named what they were trying to hide. He walked into the temple and overturned tables, coins clattering across stone like metallic insects scattering. People gasped. Someone shouted. Birds flapped wildly from the rafters, and Jude felt his heart slam against his ribs. That sound, money spilling, was more than noise. It was a declaration of war. Not against Rome. Against corruption wrapped in religion. Jude could almost taste the anger that rose in the city after that. Anger is a smell, too, in a way. Hot, sour, impossible to ignore. And then Jude saw Judas Iscariot's face during all of it. Not outrage, not awe, calculation. A man watching an investment become risky. You could feel the rivalry tighten into something sharper now. Jude didn't have proof, not the kind that would hold up in a public accusation, but he had instincts, and his instincts were screaming. Judas Iscariot was drifting away from Jesus emotionally, even while standing right beside him physically. That's the first twist of betrayal. It starts long before the act. It starts when a person secretly decides, my plan matters more than the truth. They gathered one night in a borrowed room, and the city outside sounded like distant surf, voices rising and falling, footsteps, laughter. That felt too loud, too careless. The meal began like any other meal. Bread, shared dishes, the comfort of routine. But then Jesus did something that hit Jude like cold water. Jesus stood up, wrapped a towel around his waist, and began washing their feet, not symbolically from a distance, literally. Hands on ankles, fingers scraping dust from toes, water darkening as grime dissolved into it. It was intimate in the way only humiliation is intimate. Jude watched, throat tight, because his mind couldn't reconcile it. This man spoke like God's authority, and now he was kneeling like a servant. One of the disciples tried to protest, voice trembling with embarrassment, but Jesus continued. When he reached Jude, Jude's whole body stiffened. There are kinds of shame that burn, and this was one of them. Shame that someone so pure would touch what you try to hide, shame that you need him, shame that you can't repay it. Jesus looked up at Jude while holding his foot as if it mattered, as if Jude mattered. And Jude felt something inside him crack. Something old and hard. Pride, maybe. The habit of protecting himself. Because when God kneels, you can't pretend you're above surrender. Then Jesus returned to the table and spoke words that made the room go quiet, in a way that felt unnatural. Someone there would betray him. The word betray didn't float. It dropped. Heavy. Final. Jude's eyes snapped to Judas Iscariot before he could stop himself, and the smallest thing happened. So small, most people would miss it. Judas Iscariot's expression flickered, like a mask slipping for half a heartbeat. A chill crawled up Jude's spine. The disciples started asking, one after another, voices strained, "Is it me?" Not because they thought they were villains, but because they knew they were weak. In the presence of holiness, you become painfully aware of the parts of you that could fail. Jude's mind raced, trying to connect dots. Then Jesus did another unsettling thing. He dipped bread and offered it to Judas Iscariot, a gesture that should have been tenderness, a gesture that, in that moment, felt like a spotlight. Jude watched Judas receive it, and the scene made his stomach turn, not because it was dramatic, but because it was quiet. Betrayal often happens quietly, like a blade sliding between ribs without fanfare. Then Judas Iscariot left the room. The door closed behind him with a soft sound, and Jude realized with a sick certainty that the rival he'd been watching wasn't just a threat to their safety. He was about to become a curse on Jude's own name. Jesus spoke more that night, about love, about staying close, about the world's hatred, about peace that didn't make sense. The words were beautiful, but Jude could barely hold them. Anxiety kept chewing at his attention. Because outside that room, in the dark arteries of Jerusalem, Judas Iscariot was moving, and every second that passed felt like time bleeding out. They went to a garden afterward, the kind of place that should have smelled like earth and leaves and calm. But Jude remembers it as a place of pressure. The night air was cool, yet sweat broke out on his skin anyway. Jesus stepped away to pray. The disciples tried to stay awake, but fatigue, physical and emotional, hit like a drug. Jude fought it, blinking hard, jaw clenched. He hated his own weakness, hated that sleep could steal him at a moment like this. Then it happened. Torchlight, metal glinting, footsteps, a crowd approaching with the heavy confidence of men who believe God is on their side. Jude's eyes adjusted, and he saw Judas Iscariot at the front. That was the most revolting part. Not that soldiers came, not that priests sent guards, but that the guide was one of them. Judas Iscariot moved toward Jesus with a familiarity that looked like intimacy. Jude's fists clenched so hard his nails cut into his palms. And then Judas did it. The act that would echo for centuries. He kissed Jesus. Not a kiss of love, a kiss as a signal. The kind of closeness that makes your skin crawl because it turns affection into a weapon. Jude felt nausea rise. The scene had a sick beauty to it. Torchlight on faces, the softness of the gesture, the brutality of the intent. It was the perfect image of how evil often works. Not by roaring, but by corrupting what's meant to be tender. Guards surged forward, hands grabbed. The disciples shouted. One of them swung a blade. There was a flash, a grunt, and someone's ear was severed. Blood spurted in the torchlight, shockingly bright. Jude's whole body jolted with adrenaline. For a second, he thought, this is it. We fight. We die. We prove loyalty with blood. But Jesus stopped it. He healed the wounded man. Right there, in the middle of his own arrest. That was the twist Jude never got used to. Jesus refused to let violence write the story, even when violence was being done to him. And then the disciples scattered. This part is hard to admit, and it matters because it makes Jude real. He ran too, not because he stopped loving Jesus, because fear is older than courage in the human body, because survival instincts roar louder than ideals when you hear boots and weapons. Jude fled into the dark streets and pressed himself against a cold stone wall, chest heaving, heart hammering like it was trying to escape. He listened to distant shouts and felt his soul splitting in two, one part screaming to go back, the other part begging to stay alive. He tasted bile and shame. So this was what he was, a man who loved the truth, but couldn't stand beside it when the cost became immediate. He didn't sleep. He drifted through the rest of the night and into the next day like a ghost. Jerusalem in the morning was cruelly normal. Vendors setting up, children darting between adults, animals being led through streets. And yet Jude knew the city had changed, because Jesus was in custody and the machinery of judgment had started grinding. He heard fragments, a hurried trial, accusations that didn't line up, witnesses contradicting each other, leaders twisting words like wet cloth. He learned Jesus had been beaten, not the clean kind of beating you see in controlled punishment, but the messy kind, fists, spit, a blindfold, and taunts. The kind of cruelty that turns a face into an unrecognizable map of swelling. Then came the scourging. Jude didn't watch it directly, but he saw the aftermath as Jesus was led through the streets. The image burned itself into him anyway. Jesus stumbling, back torn, blood-soaking fabric, a crown of thorns pressed into scalp so that thin rivulets ran down his temples like bitter sweat. The crowd reacted like crowds do. Some weeping, some mocking, some thrilled to be near drama, some just wanting to see a man break. And that's another disgusting truth Jude learned. Spectatorship is a drug. People will watch suffering the way they watch entertainment, telling themselves they're not responsible because they aren't the ones holding the whip. Jude tried to get closer without being seen, but fear kept him half hidden. He hated himself for it, and the hatred didn't make him braver. It made him smaller. Then they marched Jesus to the place of execution. The sound of it was what Jude remembers most. Hammers hitting iron through flesh, a wet crack that didn't sound like it should exist. Followed by screams that punched through the air and made birds explode out of nearby trees. He saw the cross raised. He saw Jesus' body hang. And in that moment, Jude's faith didn't feel like a warm light. It felt like a knife inside his chest. Because the rival had won. Judas Iscariot's betrayal had done its work. The authorities had what they wanted. The crowd got its spectacle. Rome maintained its control. The religious elite protected their status. And Jude was left with nothing but a ruined name and a ruined hope. He thought, this is what hopelessness actually is. It's watching the thing you believed in die in public. He heard Jesus cry out words that sounded like abandonment. He watched the sky dim as if creation itself didn't want to look. He saw the final convulsion of a body letting go. Then Jesus was dead. And the world didn't end. That was the cruelest part. The sun still set. People still ate. Some joked on their way home. And Jude felt a kind of revulsion at humanity. How quickly the stomach demands dinner even after the heart has been shattered. The disciples went into hiding, not as a strategic move, but as a panic response. Doors bolted. Voices kept low. Every footstep outside sounded like the start of their own arrest. Jude sat with them, but he didn't feel comfort. He felt the weight of his choices. He also felt something else. Dread about what this would do to the name Judas. Because Judas Iscariot had now become the most infamous disciple on earth, and Jude had carried that same name. It was as if someone had dipped the word itself in poison. In those hours, Jude considered disappearing, starting over somewhere far away, becoming anonymous, letting the story die and saving his own skin. Then came the next twist, one Jude wouldn't have believed if it hadn't happened to him. On the third day, rumors started leaking into their hiding place like smoke under a door. The tomb was empty. Women who had gone early to mourn came back shaken, speaking too fast, eyes bright with terror and wonder. They claimed angels. They claimed a message. Some disciples ran to check. They returned breathing hard, faces pale, and said only this: the body was gone. Jude's mind rejected it instinctively. Grief makes people hallucinate. Hope makes people lie to themselves. He had seen Jesus die. He had seen the cross. He had smelled blood. And yet the fear in the room began to change shape. It stopped being only fear of capture. It became fear of the impossible. Then, behind locked doors, when the air felt thick with panic and disbelief, Jesus appeared. Not as a memory, not as a metaphor, as a presence. Jude felt his whole body go cold, then hot. His breath caught, his hands trembled. A sob rose in his throat and got stuck there. Jesus' wounds were visible, but they didn't look like defeat anymore. They looked like proof, like scars that had passed through death and returned carrying authority. Jude's shame surged up. Shame for running, shame for hiding, shame for every cowardly calculation. But Jesus didn't speak to them like a man keeping score. He spoke peace, not the cheap peace of pretending nothing happened. The terrifying peace of forgiveness offered to people who don't deserve it. In the days that followed, Jesus met them again, teaching, restoring, speaking about what was coming next. The disciples' grief turned into something sharper and stronger, purpose. But purpose didn't erase the rivalry, because Judas Iscariot was gone, dead by his own hand, crushed under the weight of what he'd done. And that did something strange in Jude's soul. It didn't bring satisfaction. It brought a bitter, complicated sorrow. Because Jude realized the enemy wasn't just one man. The enemy was the hunger inside humans that makes betrayal possible. And if that hunger lives in one heart, it can live in many. That's why, when Jesus spoke about sending them out, Jude didn't feel triumphant. He felt the weight of it. Because preaching wasn't going to be a victory march. It was going to be a war against lies, fear, power, and the parts of people that want to twist God into a weapon. After Jesus' ascension, when the Spirit came like wind and fire, when language fractured into comprehension, when fear melted into courage, the disciples poured into public like men who had been reborn. Jerusalem heard it first, a sound like a storm inside the city's lungs. People who had hidden now spoke openly. People who had trembled now confronted crowds. The same streets that had watched Jesus dragged to death now heard his name proclaimed as life. Jude felt something ignite in him, something that wasn't adrenaline anymore. It was conviction. And conviction is different from excitement. Excitement needs applause. Conviction doesn't care. But almost immediately the backlash came. Arrests, beatings, threats. Religious authorities furious that the story refused to stay buried. Jude saw friends hauled away. He saw bruises darken skin. He saw blood on lips after interrogations. He saw believers share bread with shaking hands, praying quietly, knowing any gathering could be their last. This is the part of the saint's story that never looks pretty on icons. The kingdom spreads through pressure. And Jude became known for a particular kind of courage. Not flashy courage, the stubborn kind. The kind that walks into a hostile place anyway because someone there is desperate enough to listen. He traveled with other believers, and each road carried its own dangers, bandits, sickness, hunger, suspicion. The ancient world didn't offer safe passage because you had good intentions. Sometimes Jude would arrive in a town and learn that local leaders had already been warned about these troublemakers. Doors would shut. People would spit to ward off bad luck. Rumors would attach to them like burrs. Cannibals, because they spoke of eating body and drinking blood symbolically. Rebels, because they spoke of another kingdom. Atheists, because they refused to worship the local gods. Jude learned quickly, preaching isn't mainly about speaking. It's about enduring what your speaking provokes. And the rivalry, now without Judas Iscariot physically present, mutated into a different enemy. False voices. Men who claimed authority. Men who taught a version of faith that made them popular. Men who used Jesus' name the way Judas used Jesus' kiss, close enough to look real, corrupt enough to kill. Jude saw it happen in real time. He'd speak about repentance, about holiness, about mercy and truth braided together, and afterward, someone would pull people aside and whisper, "Don't listen to that. That's too hard. God wouldn't demand that. God wants you happy, or worse, give me your money and I'll guarantee God's favor." The old sickness using God as a ladder had survived. It had simply changed clothing. This became Jude's new battleground. Not Rome. Not just persecution, but distortion. And distortion is a devil because it feels close enough to truth to fool the hungry. Jude found himself confronting teachers with charming smiles and greedy eyes. He confronted men who preached freedom, but lived like predators. He confronted communities that wanted miracles but didn't want transformation. He learned to speak with both tenderness and steel, because mercy without truth becomes permission, and truth without mercy becomes cruelty. Some nights, Jude lay on cold ground, staring up at indifferent stars, body aching from travel, mind replaying old images. The kiss. In the torchlight, the hammer's crack, the cross rising. He'd whisper into the dark, almost angry, "Why did you let it happen that way?" And the answer, when it came, was never simple. But Jude began to understand. The cross wasn't an accident. It was the ultimate refusal to win by domination. God had chosen to defeat evil by absorbing it and breaking it from the inside. That message was offensive to many, too soft for revolutionaries, too dangerous for the powerful, too demanding for those who wanted religion as comfort without cost. Jude's ministry, his preaching, became a relentless insistence on one idea. Faith is not a charm. It is a surrender that changes you. And when communities started fracturing under false teachings, Jude's words sharpened further. He warned believers like a man warning people about a plague in the water, because he had watched what one false disciple could do. He had watched Judas Iscariot, and he refused to let the same spirit of betrayal spread through the church wearing a friendly face. Jude's letters and teachings carried that heat, the heat of someone who knows how close deception can get. He spoke about people who creep in unnoticed, who turn grace into license, who flatter to gain advantage, who promise freedom while being enslaved to their own cravings. This wasn't theology for a classroom. This was survival speech. Because Jude knew, when people are desperate, they'll listen to whoever sounds confident. And that's where the patron of hopeless causes begins to take shape, not as a sentimental figure, as a man forged by the worst kind of hopelessness, watching innocents murdered, and then rebuilt by resurrection. There were also moments of startling beauty that hit Jude like relief. He saw hardened men soften, former criminals weeping as they confessed what they'd done. He saw families reconciled after years of bitterness. He saw the sick cared for, not as charity projects, but as beloved. He saw people share what little they had without being forced. He saw communities forming across old boundaries, Jew and Gentile, rich and poor, because a new identity had cut deeper than old divisions. That, too, was shocking. Because nothing threatens empires like people who don't fear death and don't worship money. But the danger never stopped. In some places, Jude narrowly escaped mobs. In others, he watched fellow believers dragged away. He learned the sound of stones hitting flesh. He learned the smell of a prison cell. Stale air, rot, sweat. He learned to sleep lightly, to trust cautiously, to pray with urgency. And always, there was the shadow of the name. People would hear Judas and stiffen, eyes narrowing, suspicion rising. So Jude leaned harder into Thaddeus. Not to escape the past, but to protect the message from an automatic recoil. The world had turned one Judas into a warning sign. Jude couldn't blame them, but inside him, that very wound became fuel. Because if God could take a man whose name was now dangerously close to traitor and still use him to heal, to preach, to build, then no one was truly beyond redemption. That's why Jude began to attract the prayers of the desperate long before shrines ever existed. People who were dismissed by society, people with problems too tangled to explain, people whose reputations were already broken, those people heard Jude's story and thought, if God didn't discard him, maybe God won't discard me. The most dramatic twist of Jude's ministry was that he wasn't preaching from a pedestal. He was preaching from a scar. He didn't just tell people, have faith. He embodied the ugly truth beneath it. Faith can survive betrayal. Faith can survive shame. Faith can survive watching your hope die. And then, somehow, faith can rise again. As the movement expanded outward, past Jerusalem, into regions with unfamiliar languages and different gods and new hostilities, Jude's world became wider and more dangerous. Every mile increased the chance of dying far from home, buried in a place where no one would even pronounce his name correctly. Yet, he kept going. because after resurrection, safety feels smaller than obedience. And Jude had learned the paradox at the heart of his calling. The more hopeless the situation looked, the more room there was for God to act in a way nobody could fake. That's what made his message so potent. Not optimism, not denial, a holy stubbornness that stared at darkness and said, "You don't get the last word." The road ahead would demand everything from him, not only courage, but endurance, not only preaching, but sacrifice. And the last chapters of his life would seal his reputation forever, not as a comfortable saint, but as a companion for people who are one breath away from giving up. The strangest thing about surviving a miracle is that it doesn't make you immune to fear. After the resurrection, Jude could preach with a spine of steel, but he still woke up some nights with his heart racing, because memory is a stubborn animal. He still remembered torchlight. He still remembered the sound of hammers. He still remembered how quickly a crowd can turn a human being into a public object. And now he also carried a new kind of burden. Everywhere he went, the story of Jesus grew, and the enemies grew with it. Not just the obvious enemies, the officials, the mob, the men with authority and tight mouths, but the subtler rivals too, the smooth-talking spiritual entrepreneurs who saw faith as a marketplace, the charismatic teachers who could make lies sound like comfort, the predators who learned to say grace while their hands searched pockets and bodies, the people who didn't want God. They wanted a God they could control. And Jude, who had watched Judas Iscariot weaponize closeness, developed a holy allergy to that kind of corruption. That rivalry, the rivalry between truth and distortion, became the war of his later life. He went farther and farther from the places that knew his face. The roads changed. The languages changed. The gods on street corners changed. Stone faces smeared with oil, offerings rotting in bowls, incense rising like a sweet lie. In some towns, people welcomed him because they were hungry for a hope that didn't come with a knife. In others, doors shut like jaws. Sometimes the rejection was polite. Smiles, excuses, a slow backing away, like he carried contagion. Sometimes it was violent. Jude learned what it feels like to be stared at as if you are the problem. He learned how quickly a crowd can decide you are a threat simply because you refuse to bow to the local altar. He learned the sick logic of persecution. If you don't worship what we worship, you're not just wrong, you're dangerous. And yet the faith kept spreading, not because it was easy, because it was stubborn. It moved like fire through dry grass. One home at a time, one conversation at a time, one act of mercy at a time. Quiet, unglamorous, unstoppable. Jude would enter a household and see the same scene repeated in different forms. A sick child, too thin for their age, a mother's face, stretched tight with exhaustion, a father trying to look strong while fear chewed his eyes. He'd see people living under the weight of debts, shame, curses, rumors, things that strangled them without leaving fingerprints. And Jude would speak about Jesus not like an idea, but like a living fact. He'd talk about a kingdom that doesn't require you to step on someone else to stand tall. He'd talk about forgiveness like a door out of a prison. He'd talk about holiness not as performance, but as freedom from being owned by your cravings. Sometimes people listened with wet eyes. Sometimes they laughed. Bitter, mocking laughter, like they'd heard too many promises before. Jude didn't blame them, because he wasn't selling optimism. He was carrying a scarred truth. He knew what hopelessness tasted like. He knew the flavor of shame, the metallic edge of it, like blood in your mouth. He knew what it meant to run, to hide, to wonder if you'd ruined everything. And that is exactly why desperate people leaned toward him. They could smell that he wasn't pretending. But the rivals never stopped stalking the message. There were gatherings where Jude would speak, and afterward someone else would take the floor and say all the right words with the wrong spirit. Their sermons were smoother. Their demands were lighter. Their promises were cheaper. People would drift toward them because humans always prefer the painless version of truth. Jude began to confront them openly, and it made him enemies. He would name greed for what it was. He would expose hypocrisy even when it wore religious clothing. He would warn communities about teachers who slid in quietly, flattering people into spiritual sleep. And when Jude warned them, he didn't sound like a lecturer. He sounded like a man pointing at a predator in the grass. Because in his mind, the face of Judas Iscariot never fully faded. It stayed as a warning of what happens when a person stands close to holiness but refuses to be changed by it. That rivalry, the loyal disciple versus the betrayer, echoed through Jude's later years like thunder you can hear even on a clear day. And it did something else too. It sharpened Jude's compassion for people who felt stained, mislabeled, ruined. Because Jude knew what it was like to be misunderstood by your own name. He knew the humiliating reality that the world can reduce you to a single association. One infamous Judas had poisoned the name Judas for centuries. Jude could have tried to outshine that shadow with ego. Instead, he did something more radical. He became gentle, not soft, never that, but gentle in the way a strong hand can be gentle when it lifts a child. Gentle in the way. Truth can be gentle when it isn't trying to dominate. He started to lean into the name that helped people distinguish him, Jude Thaddeus, and eventually, that distinction became part of his legacy, not just as a technical detail, but as a symbol. Even if the world confuses you with the wrong story, God can still write the right one through you. As years passed, the work turned harsher. Travel carved his body down. Sun and wind roughened his skin. He learned which pains you can walk through and which pains demand you stop. He learned to pray with fewer words because suffering doesn't always leave room for poetry. And still, he kept going. Tradition says Jude traveled into regions that felt like the edge of the known world to a Galilean, places where customs were unfamiliar, and where the air smelled different, where the gods had different names, and their temples were heavy with fear. In some accounts, he worked alongside another apostle, Simon, and together they preached where the message of Jesus sounded like madness. Imagine it. Jude, standing in a foreign place, speaking about a crucified and risen Savior to people who had been trained to respect power, spectacle, status, everything Jesus refused to use. Some believed. Others felt threatened, and threats, in the ancient world, didn't stay verbal for long. Because the kingdom Jude preached did something deeply offensive to oppressive systems. It made ordinary people unbuyable, unterrifiable. People who no longer feared death were hard to control. That's when persecution sharpened from harassment into execution. Not a single dramatic scene where Jude gives a perfect speech and everyone claps. More like a tightening loop. A warning, then another, then a final decision made by authorities who wanted the new faith to stop spreading through their streets. Here's the ugly part people don't like to picture. Martyrdom rarely happens in a clean, cinematic moment. It happens with sweat and confusion and the smell of bodies and the blunt stupidity of violence. Tradition describes Jude's death in brutal imagery. Beaten, killed with a heavy weapon, sometimes portrayed with a club or an axe-like blade. These details survive in his iconography, not because the church loves gore, but because it refuses to pretend suffering is polite. Jude didn't die as a famous hero surrounded by applause. He died as a witness. And that word, witness, is what martyr means. A witness is someone who tells the truth with their whole life, and then pays the bill when the world sends it. If you want to understand why Jude became the patron of hopeless cases, start here. He wasn't protected from the worst. He went through it. He faced betrayal inside the inner circle. He watched goodness murdered in public. He lived long enough to see faith distorted by opportunists. He carried the shame of a name tainted by another man's treachery. And still, he refused to let despair write the final sentence. When Jude's life ended, it should have ended like countless other lives ended under empire. A body buried, a name forgotten, a story swallowed by time. That's what Rome and every violent system always bets on. Kill the messenger, and the message dies. But the message didn't die. It spread. It multiplied. It crossed oceans that Jude never saw. It learned languages Jude never spoke. It entered cities that didn't exist yet when he was born. And here comes the twist that makes his legacy almost darkly poetic. The very thing that could have erased him, his shared name, with the betrayer, eventually pushed people toward him. Because for centuries, many believers hesitated to pray to Judas for obvious reasons. So Jude became the apostle who was overlooked, the saint who stood slightly off to the side in the imagination of the church. And when you're overlooked long enough, you become associated with the overlooked problems too. The cases no one wants to take. The situations where people say, "There's no point trying." The lives that feel spiritually and practically finished. Jude became the saint. People turned to when other doors felt locked, not because he was weaker than other saints, but because his story carried a particular promise. God works even when the situation has been made toxic by betrayal, shame, and human failure. That's why, in devotion to Saint Jude, you'll often hear a certain kind of prayer, less like polished language, more like a hand grabbing a rope. Help me, I have nowhere else. And now we arrive at Nigeria, not as a random footnote, but as a place where Jude's meaning becomes almost painfully vivid. Nigeria is a country of enormous life, loud streets, quick humor, hard work, deep faith, music that makes your bones move. But it's also a place where millions of people know what it feels like to stare at the edge of no options. When you live in a world where a hospital bill can feel like a death sentence, where unemployment can crush dignity, where corruption can close doors, where sudden violence can steal the future, where families carry heavy burdens, hopelessness stops being an abstract word. It becomes a daily taste. And in that environment, devotion to St. Jude doesn't grow because people are naive. It grows because people are realistic. They know what it means to do everything right and still be cornered. They know the experience of praying like you're fighting for air. So in many Nigerian cities, especially in Catholic communities, but often reaching beyond denominational lines, you'll find a very specific scene, week after week. A church on a weekday that should be quiet, but isn't. Rows packed, people standing in aisles, candles burning in thick clusters, the wax pooling and hardening like layers of time. A statue or image of Saint Jude, sometimes holding a medallion of Christ, sometimes marked by a flame above the head, sometimes shown, with the instrument of his martyrdom, standing there as a reminder that faith is not for the comfortable only. You'll hear petitions spoken softly and urgently. You'll see folded papers pressed into boxes. You'll watch hands lift in prayer so fiercely the muscles tremble. You'll see students praying about exams as if their entire future is a narrow bridge. You'll see parents praying about a child's sickness with eyes that look hollowed out by nights without sleep. You'll see men who can't find work praying with jaws clenched, not wanting to cry in public. You'll see women praying about marriages, about safety, about money, about dignity. And you'll also see something else, something that hits like shock if you're paying attention. Thanksgiving. People returning to say, "I got the job. My child recovered. The debt broke. The case turned. The door opened." Sometimes they bring offerings. Sometimes they bring written testimony. Sometimes they just kneel and sob in relief. Is every story a neat miracle? No. But that's part of why the devotion holds. It doesn't require a perfect ending to be meaningful. St. Jude, in the Nigerian imagination of faith, becomes a companion in the corridor between terror and hope, a steady presence when people feel abandoned by systems and exhausted by waiting. And there's another layer that makes Jude especially powerful in Nigeria: community. In places where hardship can isolate you, where shame can make you hide, public devotions to St. Jude do the opposite. They gather people with impossible problems into one room and silently announce, "You are not alone." Even the act of showing up becomes defiance against despair. It's a kind of spiritual protest. My story is not finished. Now remember the woman from the beginning, the one with the crumpled paper that said, "I am finished." Here's what most people don't know about those petition boxes. Mixed into the pleas are also notes that say the opposite. "Thank you." And that's the emotional engine of St. Jude's legacy. He stands at the exact intersection where mixed feelings live. Satisfaction. Because yes, he really is the patron for the cases that feel beyond saving. Curiosity. Because his life contains the most haunting twist. A disciple with the same name becomes the world's most infamous traitor. And yet Jude becomes the one the desperate run to, and a certain revulsion, because betrayal, violence, and human cruelty are baked into the story. The kiss in the torchlight, the crowd, the hammer, the way people can watch suffering and still go eat dinner. Jude doesn't let you romanticize faith. He makes you look straight at the ugliness and then still believe. So when Nigerians honor Saint Jude, they're not worshiping a lucky charm. They are reaching for a witness who survived the collapse of everything and still carried hope like a torch through the dark. A saint who proves that God doesn't only show up in tidy lives, God shows up in the wreckage. And if you want the most distilled reason, he is loved as the patron of hopeless cases, especially in places where life can corner you. Here it is. Because Jude's story says in the bluntest possible way, your name can be misunderstood. Your chances can look dead. Your situation can stink of defeat. And still, the door is not locked. Not to God. Not yet.